Warwick starts crying, the inmate's crying, I'm crying, you're crying, Cody.
Yeah.
We're all crying, right? Everybody's crying. And the we walk out of the prison and I said, Warwick, where did you get that? Like, who has the ability to forgive that? Right? That's unforgivable. And he said, my mother used to tell me that in moments of challenge, you get two choices. You can be bitter or better.
This is the Business of Advice podcast, where we help good advisors become great business owners. Today is going to be a lot of fun on the Business of Advice podcast. Don Yaeger is joining me, and Don is one of the best storytellers of all time. He spent some time with some of the most well-known athletes in the history of the word also. He spent almost 20 years of his career at Sports Illustrated. He's an 11-time New York Times bestselling author, world-renowned speaker, and executive coach. On top of that, Don has just had some unbelievable access to some of the top performers in sports, and we're going to get into some of that today also. If you like podcasts, he's got a fantastic podcast called The Corporate Competitor, where he's had Fortune 500 executives, thought leaders, and Hall of Fame athletes talking about the lessons that they've learned from sports and how they apply those to business. So Don, my friend, thanks for taking the time to jump on with me.
Cody, what an honor. And as you said, we could talk forever. I love catching up with you.
Well, I was just looking, it was almost 10 years ago we met at that Darren Hardy event, which is hard to believe it's been a decade, but just appreciate you as a friend and all you've done for us. So
I feel the same. Let me tell you, that's one of those, like one of those moments when you sit and you go, gosh, I went there hoping that someone like you would be someone I would meet, but you never know. And then wow, out of it, so much greater than I could have expected.
Well, it was so cool. If you remember, we kind of connected over Make-A-Wish. You were on their national board, and I was telling you some of the things my wife and I were looking for in charities, and you're like, have you really looked at Make-A-Wish? And then as we started talking and building a friendship, I'm like, so what do you do? And you're like, do a lot of keynote speaking. And I'm like, we use keynote speakers all the time. So just for everyone who listens, we've had Don speak probably, I don't know, at least half a dozen times, if not more, for us. And so some of the things we're going to talk about today come out of that. Maybe I'll jump in there. You wrote a great book. Some of the speeches that you do are built around this, but it's The Great Teams and 16 Things That High-Performing Organizations Do Differently. One of the things that you talk about in there is the attribute that great teams have. And then you give some examples not only from the sports world, but the business world. And I know we've talked about this a lot, but would you talk through just some of the common things that you see that great teams have in both sports and business?
Well, I think the most important thing that they have is this sense of community, right? It's not when I win, we win. That's the beauty of a great team, is that they appreciate each other for what each brings to the equation. I think that's true in either sports or business, and that when you get and a little competition, internal competition is a good thing, but it's got to be healthy. It's got to be right. It can't be a willingness to undercut one another, and we see that in dysfunctional organizations. But the best teams are one where I'm as happy, or I try to be, for your success as I would be for my success. And finding that collection of people together requires great recruiting. It requires a strong culture. It requires leadership that declares this as important and then holds others accountable. It requires an understanding of deadlines. How are we going to make sure that we're and a understanding that there are some periods when you just have to play your game at a higher level, right? There are some windows in which we just know an extra gear has to be available. And are all of those things, those are places where sports can learn from business and business can learn from sports.
Is there one of those that maybe jumps out to you as the most important as you think through some of those different things? And maybe, I always tend to go to leadership because I think everything kind of rises and falls on the leader, and a lot of examples of that right now in sports as well as business. But any others that just, and maybe that's the one that jumped out to you too, but just that you think's like most important?
Well, I think what I appreciated was, often we think of leadership somewhat singularly, right? We think of a head coach, right? But what really you define as the great organizations, and we'll just use football for an example, right? And we'll use professional football. When you have an owner, a general manager, and a head coach and a quarterback, right? When your four essentially leaders are all in line, in sync, and all have a similar vision, they understand where they're going. It's not four different ideas around what might need to come next. When those four things are in line, what you find is exceptional, right? You find a sustained excellence. I mean, you look at the Patriots for all those years. What was it, right? It was Crafts, it was Belichick, and it was Brady. The converse of that would be the Washington Redskins, right? Which is dysfunction at every level. Sorry, any Redskins fan, but it's because they can't ever seem to line up together. So yes, it's leadership, but it's leadership cascaded that really is something that I think I learned more about while working on that project.
In there, Don, and I should plug the book, right? If people love sports and business, that's one of the best ones to read. But you talk about the characteristics of true champions. Were there any characteristics that surprised you, like something you wouldn't have expected?
I think the one that really came up that really caught my attention was how intentional, and intentional is a really key word in anything that's exceptional, right? How intentional they were about their huddles. And that one caught my attention because we all have to do meetings.
Mm-hmm.
They're generally the bane of our existence. And we are, but the best teams know how to maximize the value of that time together. They use huddles as actually a strategic advantage as opposed to a marked, check on your clock, right? I mean, an appointment you have to attend. And so, how do you create energetic huddles? How do you create huddles where everything is done well, done efficiently, and when you find that special space and huddles become an advantage for you, you suddenly, you're creating an advantage while your opponent, maybe the other company that you might be competing against, is sitting around with a bunch of people rolling their eyes and not contributing.
It's funny. I think it's one of the areas, Dave and I constantly are figuring out how we get better at, and we're still not anywhere where we probably should be. But every single great leader, business owner I've talked about talks about that, like how important great meetings are, right? Yet so many of us, I know a lot of people that listen to this podcast, a lot of the advisors we work with, like they don't put the effort into making those team meetings great. And the one maybe thing I've seen, and I'll apply this to sports, like the person who controls the huddle is not the offensive lineman, right? It's the quarterback. It's the leader of the team. And I think that's just a realization Dave and I have had. If our meetings are going to be better, it comes to me and him being prepared and coming in there and really controlling the flow of that meeting. And I think that's that's a great one because I think everyone could probably get better at that, and it does have a huge impact. So,
an example that we used in the book that turned out to be really revelatory to a lot of people. It's one that I've probably gotten more notes back on than anything else in the book. Is Coach Krzyzewski at Duke, and you can love him, hate him, whatever you want, but he's pretty darn good at what he does. A few years ago, he was noticing that he was broadcasting because his team had been knocked out of the NCAA tournament, and he saw a particular game, high-profile game, in which an important important huddle was happening, and several of the players outside the huddle were so unengaged. They were waving at people in the stands. They were doing things. And ultimately, one of those people yelled something during the game, that they hadn't been listening to the huddle. And that became a problem. So Coach started videotaping all of his huddles.
Wow.
He has his video crew videotape the huddles, and he grades each player, just like we grade a player on their offensive efficiency or defensive efficiency. He grades each player on their participation in the huddle. So as you're a player and you're trying to rise up within the organization, are you engaged or are you not? And his whole thing was, if you're not engaged, leave the arena, right? Don't sit here and become a distraction. I loved it.
Well, think about that as a leader. If you started doing that when you walked into every one of your team meetings of like, at
Camera.
least, yeah, just, hey, we're going to see who's engaged. So, hey, Don, one of the things you've heard me say this a lot, but our mission here is to make good advisors great business owners. And you've studied and spent time with some of the best minds in not just sports, but a ton of business also. Are there any universal keys that you've seen that took a team or a business or a leader from good to great?
There are. I actually wrote down two when I was looking at your questions because I wanted to be well prepared to be with you. And so it's interesting because I think the first one is a high curiosity quotient, right? We measure EQ and IQ. The great leaders are highly attentive to their CQ. They are constantly asking questions. They don't know it. They're asking questions and they're reading and learning often about things that have nothing to do with their specific industry. They're just out seeking goodness, right? What they can learn from the world because all of it can apply back in if we do it. So high curiosity quotient. And you're looking for that also in the teammates that you want to surround yourself with.
Yeah.
Are they asking good questions? Are they doing something to develop themselves? Is reality TV all they do as soon as they leave work? The second one is that the best are locked in on service and purpose, right? And I know that's so important to you, Cody, in the way that you guys run Advisors Excel. I know it's also important to many of your advisors, but it's not just about the leader being locked in on service and purpose. It's about teaching the rest of your team how what you do matters and who it matters to. And many of us, we're the possessor of great information about how what we do affects others, but we don't share that information well enough. It either sounds arrogant or whatever. We need to be better. The team has to be more included in an understanding of why what we do matters.
That's great. I remember hearing this quote once. I think it was Darren Hardy was interviewing some mega, CEO, famous CEO for Success Magazine, and they said something. They said nothing leads to failure more than success. And meaning, once you start having some success, you relax, you stop doing all the little things that make the difference. You and I have had this conversation a lot. You mentioned Coach K as an example. I mean, he wins consistently year after year. I think the only coach to ever win a championship in 3 different decades. And there's other examples about that. But one of the things that you talk about in the book is avoiding the pitfalls of success, which is kind of what those apply to. So how as a leader, as you're having success in business, can you continue to keep your team engaged and push your team to continue to succeed? What are some of the things that you've seen from the best?
So, it's an understanding that what you're talking about is real, and that too often it's human nature, right?
Yep.
So what you're really asking people to do is to defy human nature. That's what you're asking in this effort to not take your foot off the gas after success, not slow down and celebrate and wait for that island vacation where you get to go with all the famous people that you hang out with, Cody. It's not about that. It's about trying to I love an example. I'm working on a book right now. You met him because of our conversations with Scott Drew, the coach who won the basketball championship at Baylor, right? My big question to him was, great, you guys won. You had this amazing success. You got a whole new team next year. How do you not let last year's success bleed into whatever you're going to face this year? And he had this really great example. He started talking about, we've heard a lot of people talk about, I want to go 1-0 this week, right?
Yep.
In the NFL, that's your phrase. I want to be 1-0 this week. Well, Scott is actually far more granular because it's kind of his nature. He goes, I want to be 1-0 on every decision, right? I want to be thinking about everything I'm doing and try to win every decision. He said, for example, we were having breakfast, and he said, this morning, I wanted to be 1-0 over breakfast, right? I wanted to order egg whites with a spinach and a turkey sausage. He said, but truthfully, I ordered the hash browns, so I wasn't 1-0, right? But the point there is to try to be 1-0 on every decision, right? I want to be 1-0 on every decision. And he said, but truthfully, I ordered the hash browns, so I wasn't 1-0, right? But the point there is to try to be if you're trying to be 1-0 in every decision, everything you're doing, the idea that you had success in the background is exactly where it is. It's in the background.
He not to get off topic a little, but you did set up that meeting. So we had my son down at Baylor. We were doing a college visit down there, and we got a chance to spend some time with Coach Drew, and he was incredible. So you can see just the culture. And ironically, one of the questions I asked him, he actually was gracious, spent about an hour with us, took us through their facility, and spent a bunch of time with Dylan trying to convince him to come to Baylor. But one of the questions I asked him, I said exactly what you said. It's, anytime you get a chance to ask someone, like that, a question, I said, what are you doing different? Or now that you've had the success, how do you avoid that complacency? One of the other things he told me on top, he said something very similar to what you just said. You articulated it better than I would. But the other thing he told me is he said, I started talking, and this is what I think is so important about what you do, what we try and do, personally, but also with our advisors. He said, I called Dabo Swinney, and I called Nick Saban, and he just started rattling off. He's like, I started asking all these other great coaches and leaders, how'd you handle this after you went through it, and just got a lot of input and a lot of advice from them. And it was amazing and I know you've seen it, you kind of told me about it, but the culture he has built down there was
crazy,
fascinating. And, I think I told you this story, but we met through just the tour. One was in a coach's office, one was in the weight room, one was shooting baskets. We met 5 different players as he's touring us through, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing, came over to us, shook our hand, looked us in the eye, and introduced themselves, all 3. The one kid was at the other end of the gym shooting baskets. I had my back turned to him. 10 seconds later, he's right beside me, and he said, hey, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to come over and introduce myself. And you don't see that with a lot of 18, 19-year-old, star basketball players, but just the little things. And I only share that because I think any great leader pays attention to the details and the little things, and is constantly instilling that culture in the people around them also. So it was a lot of fun.
If Dylan doesn't go to Baylor, then Scott Drew will consider it a failure.
Yeah, so. He was a better recruiter than the people who toured Dylan around campus. I'll tell you that for sure. So, hey, one thing I want to ask you about is so much of what you do, I would say, is storytelling. So whether that's writing, speaking on stage, and I think a lot of our advisors have realized over the years just how important storytelling is. You're great at it. I don't know if you always were, so I'll ask you this question. How did you develop, or how have you continued to develop your storytelling ability?
It's funny because every bit of this conversation will align, right? Somebody will go back at the end of it and start ticking off things, and they'll see it. So it started for me 35 years ago. I was a freshman in college. I'd come home for Thanksgiving. And I remember my father had always tried to talk to me about storytelling being, he said that storytellers are the greatest leaders, they're the greatest coaches, he said they're the greatest dinner guests, right? Yeah. If you want to be more impactful, be a better storyteller. And he said this to me growing up. My dad was a preacher. And but I'm there. It's Thanksgiving. My father is, and we had just tons of people every year for Thanksgiving, and so my Thanksgiving dinner starts. My father stands up and he starts telling a story, and that was the first time I remember. Instead of watching my father, I watched other people watching my father, and it hit me. He's right. If I could just tell a better story, if I could do exactly what he did, which was recount a simple chance encounter with a young man at a diner who now was in the presence of the room, right? If I could do something as simple as that and do it well with dialogue and with good use of pauses and with an understanding of inflection and body language, that people are riveted by great storytelling. You look at the end of an hour of a great storyteller and you marvel that the clock has really sped that quickly.
Yep.
And so I took that moment and went and made a list of who I thought were the best storytellers on the planet. And I started studying them. What do they do? What are the things that make them so memorable? And I built a database of storytellers' habits And I then try to figure out how I could weave some of what I was learning into the stories I would ultimately one day get a chance to share. And so this is about study. It's
Yep.
about modeling. It's about, it's about trying to figure out how you can take those things, make yourself better.
One thing I've seen when you are on stage is you have this ability to connect through the stories that you tell. Is there any tricks, any secrets? Our advisors are telling stories all the time, whether it's they're doing a seminar or webinar or sitting one-on-one with a client, any of those things. Any advice on like how to really connect through storytelling?
So, two things I would say. One is the more you know about the people you're speaking to, the more opportunity. Instead of giving your stale pitch, right, the same thing that you've said to the seven people who walked through your door previously, or the seven audiences the more you know about them in advance, the better you can be at tweaking what you already are going to share to be connective to them, right?
That's great.
I
Yep.
know you're a Kansas State guy. I know things about you that allow me, while I'm trying to be impactful to you, I'll bring something that will be important to you into the conversation, and you'll go, dang, he just talked about something that matters to me. Most often we're busy telling people what we want to tell them, not what the listener will react to. So your ability to have some level of understanding of who they are, and then secondly, why do they need to be listening, right? And that requires an empathy. And once you've figured out why they should be listening, and what story that you have in your quiver, right? What arrow can you pull that most connects you to them? And you'll only do that if you know more about them than the other advisors that they're competing against. And you'll only know that if you've got stories prepared, and you're not telling them this story's for you.
Yep.
It's a totally different story about how you solve someone's problem, but they hear themselves in your story. And when they hear themselves in your story, you've won.
That's interesting, of having, and I'm sure advisors maybe do it instinctually a little, but I've seen you speak a lot of different times, and I've seen you speak to different audiences, and I've seen you pull. I guess the great thing about writing a book with 16 different characteristics is you have 16 different stories. But just as you were saying that, it was kind of this light bulb of like, if I were a business owner or if I were an advisor, having 15 or 16 different stories that are super applicable, because I've heard you share a different story depending upon the audience that you're speaking to. But it's a story that you've shared before, right? It just is very applicable. So that's a really good takeaway, I think, for anyone listening, is build the stories that are going to address all the different situations, and then be able to retell that as needed.
And act like you're telling it for the first time.
Yeah,
Each time.
exactly. I've seen you
Yeah.
pause and act like, a little tear at the right time. And so,
Look, it's a weakness, I guess, but I am highly emotional.
yeah,
And so I actually do cry at stories, my own stories, often because I get caught up in them. Like, I
well,
put myself back in the moment, and I can hit that.
that
So
that may be a good transition. Every time you've told that work done story, I've cried, and I've heard it like 8 times, I think, but it never matters. Like I cry every time too. So maybe we'll transition. You have spent a lot of time with a lot of famous athletes. I want to talk through one, because I think the stories are a lot of fun, but more importantly, I want to hear just some of the lessons that you've learned from them. So if it's okay, let's walk through some of the people that you've spent some time with,
sure.
tell a little bit about the story, and then just, I think, the big takeaway or lesson that you learned from them. So I'll start with maybe the most famous one. Rumor has it that you beat Michael Jordan in a game of one-on-one. So is that true, first and foremost? But then what I'd be really interested to hear is, what did you learn from your time around Michael Jordan?
Well, so yes, on the rumor, yes, and it's funny. I still run into Jordan at events, and he will ask me, "Are you still telling that BS story, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, Michael, every day. If I get a chance, I tell the story every day.
That's the only reason I
Um,
put it in here, just so you could tell me. Yeah, it's
exactly.
pretty cool.
So today I get to check today off my list. This is good. Yeah, no, he does an old man basketball camp, and he invites a handful of guys to go one-on-one with him. I happen to be one of those people. He makes the point though that that in the 9 years he had done it, there would be 180 people, 20 people a year who would have done it in this opportunity, and only five had ever scored on him, and there wasn't going to be another person that year. And as it happened, I just decided I wasn't gonna. I'd watched him dunk on a number of other people.
Because he
who
gets
were
the ball
trying
first, right? It's
he
a
gets the ball
game to
first.
one.
Game to one. He gets the ball first.
Yeah.
And I'd watched him dunk on a number of the people who were in front of me on the line in the line. So I decided to step back, and I was going to just cut off any kind of a driving lane that he might, as if I could really
Yeah,
do
yeah.
that. But I had imagined myself cutting off a driving lane. And so he looked at me and he said, "Are you really going to give me this shot?" And I looked back and I said, "I don't think you have it in you," which is a play on his Gatorade
Yeah.
commercial, right? Is it in you? And everybody started laughing because I trash talked him, and he just shakes his head, goes up, takes the shot, and misses. And when the shot goes wide, because I was separated from him, I actually had a shot at getting the rebound. I did, got
You
it
had a
back
good
outside
head start
I
on the
had-
rebound.
I had a head start, let me tell you. But I got it, took it back outside the 3-point line, and he's now stepping out to guard me. And I looked back and I said, "Aren't you going to return the favor?" As if I'd done him a favor by being a lousy defender. And he says, "I know you don't have that shot in you." And as he said it, he was busy talking. His hands were down, and I just let it fly 26 feet.
What kind of a prayer did you say as you let it go?
Dude, I'm so connected to my God that I didn't have to stop and pray right there.
He knew you needed his help.
He did. And anyway, yes, nothing but net. Ball goes in. Crowd, the other guys all go crazy. Jordan has a few choice words for me. Starts asking about a rematch. To which I said, "Dude, you had your shot." And and it remains, like, for me, the athletic highlight of my entire life.
Pretty
right?
good
It
one.
happened one moment, one shot. So, but what did I learn from Jordan was that his competitiveness extends to this idea that he doesn't want to lose at anything he does. Right? There are many of us who we fail, something happens, and we've come up with an answer for it. We've got an excuse, we've got a referee to blame, a regulator that didn't give us the ruling that we wanted. Whatever it is, we have an answer for failure. And what he taught me was that the great ones, they take all excuses off the table, right? They own moments when things don't go their way, because that's the only way you improve, right? His line to me was, "A loss is not a failure until you make an excuse." And I love that line. It still hangs on a sticky on my wall, because for me, it's, again, human nature. We don't want to be the one. We don't have to acknowledge that we weren't as good as we hoped we wanted to be. And so our answer is, let's blame somebody else. We can't do that. The great ones don't do that.
So second, great story, and you can see that. I think everyone forgot how competitive he was until they did that Bulls, documentary. So it reminded all of us, I think, of just how competitive he was. So another person that you had a really unique relationship with and access to was the legendary UCLA coach, John Wooden. Can you maybe talk a little bit of the background of that in your relationship with him?
Changed my life. I was a writer at Sports Illustrated, and I had heard that this young Los Angeles Lakers basketball star, Shaquille O'Neal, was going out every month to spend part of an afternoon with an 88-year-old basketball legend named John Wooden. And I thought, what could those two have in common, right? And Dale Brown, who was Shaq's coach in college, is a great friend and also a good friend with Coach Wooden. And I asked Dale, and we got invited to join Shaq and Coach Wooden for an afternoon mentoring session. And I was amazed. Like, they didn't talk basketball once in 3 hours. They talked about being a better father, better husband, a better leader, better teammate. And, what are his stories and examples? We got up, and I looked at Coach Wooden and I said, "This was extraordinary. Thank you. I'm going to, write this story." But I'm wondering, how does someone become mentored by someone like you? Like, you are so amazing. And he looked at me and he said, you ask. And I said, well, how many people ask? And he said, not as many as you might think.
Hmm.
Most people take themselves out of the equation before they ever, by not asking. They're sure that Cody Foster's not going to have time to mentor me, right? They are sure that there is no way I could ever learn. He'd take time to teach me. So they don't ask. I go back, write the story, call Coach Wooden a month later. And I told him, I said, as I was standing there, I felt like I was supposed to ask. And he said, I wonder what took you so long. And for the next 12 years, every other month, I would fly to California for a day with John Wood. I got 500 hours of recorded conversation. He just, and every time I went, the rules of engagement were that I had to come prepared to ask questions. And when I ran out of questions, the session ended, which meant I came with a lot of questions,
Yep.
right? I prepped for the opportunity. And then I had to come back and teach him and share with him the next time I met him how I used something he taught me in the last session that made me better in the interim, which gave him the energy to want to give me more, right? Often we ask mentors all these questions and then we never share with them what we've done with what they've taught us. And what he wanted me to be clear on was that he gained energy when I told him how I was better because of him. And you don't think a guy with 10 national championships needs any energy from a slug like me, but he did. And that grew into this incredible relationship. A couple of weeks from now, his daughter, who was one of my favorite people, she just recently passed, and they're doing a celebration of her life. And like, I'm flying to California to be part of the celebration because I so love what that family gave me and how they shaped me.
Well, just in that, there's a couple really big lessons I think for any business owner leader. One, don't be afraid to ask, right? So if you don't ask, you're not going to get it for sure. But I think the second one is, if you get the time to spend time with other successful people that you want to learn from, is to make sure that you come prepared, right? That you're not wasting their time, and that you're very specific on what it is that you want to learn and what you want to know from them. And you know this a little bit even in doing your own podcast, right? You come prepared for these. So we put a bunch of time in to make sure that we're going to make the most use of this time. And that's a really important one. There's so many great stories I think about Coach Wooden. One of the ones that I always have heard, and I've heard you talk about it, is he talked about, or the story was, every year at their first practice, his first tutorial was about how you put your socks on and how you lace your shoes up. Kids that have been playing basketball their whole life, he started every new season with that. I think the way you've said it is, it's the importance of paying attention to the little things. Talk about just maybe how he applied that or what that meant.
So his whole discussion there, and ironically, I read your questions last night, but I mean, this morning I put my shoes and socks on. I rubbed the bottom of my foot to make sure there was no wrinkle. I do everything as he was teaching it to me, because his point was, we want desperately to do big things. All of us do, right? We all want to hit home runs, but a successful life is built on hitting singles all day long, right? It's about doing the detail work, the little things that other people don't want to do. It's that one more phone call. It's that, it's that extra 10 minutes of research. Whatever it is, it's the things that others don't want to do are where you're going to separate yourself from your competitors. And Coach Wooden said, if you don't manage the little details, right? Don't rub the bottom of your foot so there's no wrinkle in your sock. You're going to go out to practice and you're going to get a blister while running up and down. If you get a blister, you don't want to practice the next day. If you don't practice, you don't play. If you don't play, we don't win, right? And so, details matter. And often the little details, the ones others can't see, are the ones that we forsake. And in our failure to do those details, to deliver on them, we are costing ourselves opportunity.
That's good. And you've met a lot of the advisors we work with. They're I think the best in the industry. A lot of them have success year over year. Obviously, Coach Wooden won 10 titles, I think 7 in a row, if I remember right.
But 7 in a row.
What Were there a few things you took away from him that he attributed that success to, and maybe even back to that, kind of how we started of not letting that success, keep you from continuing that could apply to the advisors we work with in their own business?
Yeah, it was really important to him that the past be treated as irrelevant, right? He never allowed them to be called defending national champions. Now you can't help what the arena does, that you're an opposing arena, but at his home arena, they never said you're defending national champions, because you're defending nothing, right? The truth is, it's a new season. These are new players. It's not, I mean, last year was last year. So it's sometimes it's about even languaging. Like, are you busy? How much time are you spending telling everybody how great you used to be? And the more time you spend talking about how great you used to be, the less time you are sharing with them how you're going to be great for them in the future. And so, it's those kinds of details. They again, I loved it. Never defending champs.
That's good.
I'm. That was last year.
So one final maybe sports story I'd love for you to talk about, and mainly because of impact. And I think people, as they become more successful, start thinking about how they can make an impact on others. Hopefully they think about it right away, but it's I think just such a key area of, as you grow as a business, if you want to have that success, like figuring out a purpose a little bigger than yourself. And I said it at the beginning, but it's my favorite story that you tell, and it's a story about Warwick Dunn, who is someone who had, maybe one of the most tragic things that can ever happen to a person happen, but he's really used that to make an incredible difference in this world. Would you share his story a little, and then also what you've learned from him?
Yeah, Warwick, was this great little high school football player, 5'8", 178 pounds, tiny. And yet he was so impactful, so good on the field that every major college coach in the South made their way over his senior year of high school to his mother's couch to ask if he would play football at their university. And his mother's name was Betty Smothers. She was a police officer and the single mom of 6 children. Warwick was her oldest. The senior season, they finished the year. Warwick and his mom are making the decision where he's going to go to play. And on Christmas morning, they wake up, they give out gifts to the 5 younger brothers and sisters. And in the afternoon, they sit down and they read and they look at the last 3 scholarships he's considering. And they choose that he's going to go play for Bobby Bowden at Florida State. They actually called Coach Bowden. And every day for the rest of his life, Coach Bowden said it was the greatest Christmas gift he was ever given. But a couple of weeks later, Warwick's cell phone rang. It was the Baton Rouge police calling to tell him that his mother had actually been shot and killed in a robbery at a bank. Warwick was 3 days past his 18th birthday, but he was the man. He was the man of the house. Bowden called him, said, "Look, you don't need to come to Florida State. Stay at LSU. Stay there in Baton Rouge." And Warwick said, "Coach, there's no way. My mother and I made that choice together, and I would never dishonor her. Like, I will be there, but I'm going to need a slightly larger apartment," which is pretty awesome because he brings his 2 youngest brothers and sisters and he puts them through elementary and middle school while he plays at Florida State. He helps that team win its first ever national championship. And by the time his 4 years are done, he graduates with a degree in business, and he becomes, and he's the all-time leading rusher in the history of the university. The NFL draft, Tony Dungy chooses to use the 12th pick of the first round of the draft to select Warwick Dunn. And when others are asking Coach, Dungy, what are you thinking? He's so small, there's no way he's going to last. Dungy said, everybody else measures athletes by height and weight. I measure them by the size of their heart. And by that standard, this guy belongs in the league. He ends up playing 13 years in the NFL. He rushes for 11,000 yards, 5,000 yards receiving. And he retires just a couple of years ago to become the first African-American part owner of the Atlanta Falcons, right? The guy, he belonged. But a couple of years, right after he is drafted, he actually walks into Coach Dungy's office and he wants to start a charity. He wants to buy homes for women like his mother, single moms, who, were just trying to keep a roof over the heads of their children. And Warwick wanted them to experience something his mother never did, which was home ownership. And so he begins a charity there as a rookie. And this, Cody, because Advisors Excel is one of the number in this. But they just gave away their 198th home to a single mom just a couple of weeks ago in Baton Rouge. There's one home in Topeka because of you, but 198 single moms, and 518 children are in homes today because of Warwick Dunn. The guy's incredible, right? He wins the NFL's Man of the Year award, Walter Payton Man of the Year award, and he gets a chance to write a book. He asked me to write it with him. And as we're coming down to the end of writing the book, I asked him a question. I asked him, he had never spent any time in the presence of the man that killed his mom. But back then, I understand what he couldn't. But I wanted to know, if that man were to sit down with him today, what kind of questions would Warwick ask him? What would he say? Warwick goes, whoa, that's more than I thought we'd be covering today. And he gets up and he walks out of my office. But 2 days later, he comes back and he hands me a notebook filled with questions. Like he had thought about everything he would ever say or ask that man over those 2 days. As it happened, in those 2 days, a friend of mine, Dale Brown from Louisiana, had called and we were talking. And I told him about Warwick leaving, and he shares with me that there's a rule, a law in Louisiana, that if you're the victim of a crime that leads the perpetrator to death row, victim, perpetrator, and you as a victim fill out certain paperwork, the Louisiana Department of Corrections will expedite a meeting between victim and inmate because they want the victims to find closure. So Warwick hands me the questions, and I reach around, I hand him the article, and I went, look at this. You could actually go ask your questions. Whoa, Warwick said, I don't know. But he comes back 3 days later, and he said, let's go to Louisiana. I want to ask the questions. Well, we did. And 6 months later, we end up at Angola State Prisons, toughest prison in America. 91% of the inmates who enter there leave in a body bag. And we end up on death row, and we're there with the inmate, and the inmate's got lawyers with him, and the inmate's now changed this story. And he now claims he wasn't even there the night it happened. And after about 30 minutes of listening to the inmate share his story, there's Warwick, there's myself and his high school coach, there's the inmate and his two lawyers in this very small private room. Warwick holds up his hand and he says, if you weren't there that night, I don't know why you came here today, but I came here today to forgive you. And Warwick starts crying. The inmate's crying. I'm crying. You're crying, Cody.
Yeah.
We're all crying, right? Everybody's crying. And we walk out of the prison, and I said, Warwick, where did you get that? Like, who has the ability to forgive that? Right? That's unforgivable. And he said, my mother used to tell me that in moments of challenge, you get two choices. You can be bitter or better. And as my son, I ask you to always be better. And he said, I wanted in that moment to make my mother proud. And I look at him and I think about adversity differently, right? Because there isn't anything in my life that can compare.
Yep.
There isn't anything I'll experience that can compare. But I do know bitter or better are lessons I can apply. Sadly, I've chosen bitter too many times in my life. But since meeting Warwick, I've done my better. I've done as much as I can to be better in those moments. Sorry.
Well, it's such a great, I'll give you a little time. Yeah, it's such a great example, I think, of just the power of you get to choose how you respond to situations, right? And we hear that, but we don't necessarily apply it. The other thing I love about Warwick, the chances that we've got to meet him and just seeing what he's done, is being able to take a negative in your life and use it as fuel to go make an impact, right? It's I think that's why his charity is so cool, is it's so personal, and so tied to what he's done. And it's pretty neat. You were here when we gave that house away, and just to see.
Can I take a minute and call you out on that?
You can if you want. Yeah.
So for those who are listening who may not know this, it was 7 years ago. Crazy.
Yeah.
Because you sent me pictures the other day.
Picture.
Yep. I had told that story, a longer version of it, on several stages for your team. And you invited me to come do it again. I went, and at the end of my telling of that story, you guys came on the stage and you said, by the way, for the to the audience, uh, because we've heard this story, because we've so believed in what Don's talking about Warwick doing, power of purpose of doing something big, we're leaving here and we're driving over to this other part of town where a young mother and her children are going to get a house for the very first time, and it's because we, the Advisors Excel team, did exactly what Warwick encouraged. And Don, you get to hand her the keys. And I remember I just started crying. Like I could, you hope sometimes when you tell a story that it has impact. You don't expect it to have the kind of impact that you guys delivered on there. And on the way there, my wife was with me and she's like, you should call Warwick. You should tell him about how cool this is. I said, I would, but I can't complete a sentence right now. Like I was so emotional. So we got there and I'm like all freaked out and trying to figure out like, how am I going to hold it together enough to do this? And suddenly my wife's eyes got really big and I didn't realize that you had flown Warwick in to be there for the event. And so we do the event and we're inside the house. And I don't know if you recall this, Cody, but we're inside the house. And one of the things that Warwick's charity does is they learn everything they can about the family so that when it's time for the family to walk through the door, everything they need is in the house. Mm-hmm. And so the mother had her oldest son was about 11, and Warwick's team had discovered that the kid loved mac and cheese. So Warwick knew this, and so while we're going through the house, Warwick walks the kid into the kitchen, and he opens up the pantry, and there it is, top to bottom, mac and cheese, right? And I think your team had stocked it, which was so cool. And so Warwick points out to the kid that they knew and that he was getting, and the kid looks at his mother. Now, this was hard to say without crying. And he said, Mom, we need to go to the food pantry today. And she's like, son, what are you talking about? Look, we have everything. And the kid says, yeah, but today we have something we can give.
Yep.
And I remember as we were talking later, it was like, man, you want to say that you found the right family to give it to?
Yeah.
That was the right family.
It was cool, and that's led to such a great partnership with Habitat for Humanity, which is an incredible organization that I'll just give a plug for them. People should check out. We've continued to do that with them, and it's pretty special. So, all right, we should stop crying and try try and move on.
All right, so we'll change the name of your podcast.
Well,
Tune in crying.
I want to change just a little direction here. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the sports figures you had relationships with, but you also wrote a series of New York Times bestsellers with Brian Kilmeade that were about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson. And side note, if you're a history buff listening to this, you absolutely have to read these books because it kind of tells these little-known stories, but also how these little-known stories literally kind of change the direction of the United States. But are there leadership traits, as you went through that you just saw within those three gentlemen that transcend time or politics?
Absolutely. I think the one that really stood out to me is that, for all three of them, there were long stretches of their leadership back then that people questioned, like, were they worthy? Were they up to this task? Were they the right leaders? Were they this? Were they that? And there are so many times we as leaders doubt ourselves, where we as leaders look and go, gosh, are we? History will reflect that those are three of the greatest leaders the United States has ever had, right?
Yep.
And yet, so sometimes it's a matter of being ready and able to understand that in the moment, leadership isn't always pretty. It's seldom, it's seldom reflected as it will be. In history will give us a real and better view. So appreciate that this is a difficult moment. Whatever it is that you're going through, history might reflect on it differently. Just do whatever you do it with principle. And I think that's the thing I learned from all three of those. Done with principle, history reflects them as among the greatest ever.
You know, one of the things I took from them too, reading them, and another book I read kind of during COVID, which was a great book to read, was The Splendid and the Vile, which is about Winston Churchill during kind of the bombings. It also puts things in perspective. You know, when you read those books about kind of the situations those guys were facing and the decisions that they had to make, you know, it's just a good reminder that, and I used to say this after I read The Splendid and the Vile, you know, it was the most dire circumstance ever, but that's still one of the greatest countries, you know, almost 100 years later, still one of the greatest countries ever. London's one of the greatest cities ever, you know, so a lot of times we worry a lot more about in the moment, you know, what's going on in the decisions we have to make, but make the decision and move on. And there's only so much you can do. So keep in perspective, you know, a historical outlook. So I think sometimes I said this, I think sometimes we're historically naive. You know, we talk about how awful the last year was and all the challenges, and like in the history of our country and other countries, like, you know, it was something, but I don't know that it was the most, you know, insane thing we've ever dealt with. So, okay, well, one final story I want to ask you about, and then pivot to something else. You've also spent time with a couple of guys that I would call heroes, maybe not sports figures, and one is recent. You just wrote a book with Kyle Carpenter, who was a U.S. Marine who in Afghanistan jumped on a grenade to save his fellow Marines. And then the second, you wrote a book called Devoted, which was about Dick and Rick Hoyt. And a lot of people, if they don't know that name, they would recognize him because Rick was born a quadriplegic, and his dad, Dick, has carried him on marathons, triathlons, 7 Ironmans. What, from those two guys, because, you know, I think what Dick has done for his son, what Kyle has done for others, what did those two, in writing their book, teach you about leadership, serving others, fighting through adversity?
You know, I think the thing that really stood out for me with both of them is, again, you know, Kyle was a corporal, right? He's a low. It doesn't get much lower ranked in the Marines. Dick was a father who had no running shoes, right? Neither one of them set out to become famous or to become, you know, legendary or heroes to other people. They just did what they thought was right. And in Kyle, the big lesson for me with Kyle was, as you said, here's a guy dove on a grenade to save the guy next to him, declared dead 5 times, goes through 70 surgeries to put him together, 3 years at Walter Reed in order to rebuild his body. But his goal was to go out and run a marathon, right? He wanted to run a marathon. He wanted to do something post-accident that he didn't ever do pre-accident. And when I asked doctors there, when I was there at Walter Reed to go visit, Kyle went on a gratitude tour with me while we were writing the book. Went to the surgeons who put him back together in Germany. He went to say thank you to the pilots who flew him out. He found them. They were stationed in Las Vegas, and he went there to visit them. He went on a gratitude tour, which is really powerful. But secondly, the doctors told me that there were other people on that ward at Walter Reed who were far less injured than Kyle, who are still there today, or are still in some level of. Kyle's out running marathons. And the answer to the question was that every day, some people wake up and they look at God and they say, why did you do this to me? Like, you know, I was a good person. I was this, I was that. Why me? Kyle woke up every morning, put his feet on the ground, and looked at God and said, thank you for another day. You mentioned the word perspective earlier, right? Perspective is the gift that we control, right? It is the opportunity we can manage. And it is, to me, it's such a beautiful thing about Kyle's story.
That is so cool. I know I've had you on here for a while, so I want to try and wrap you up.
Dude, I would talk all day long with you.
I know, but
I feel bad for your listeners.
I want to ask you about, a mutual friend now. I told you we had John Maxwell at our event this summer and just was spectacular. But You and I have been talking about him a lot, and you're doing some really cool stuff with John. You're going to be part of kind of his organization in a way. Would you talk about that? But then maybe just as you've spent some more time with John, it just any like things that you've learned from him that you think are applicable to a business owner.
So, yes. First off, the first half of your question, John is 74, right? I mean, you wouldn't, if you look at his schedule, you see his travel, and it's just crazy what he does.
Yep.
I mean, the guy still does the hokey pokey on the stage, which is wrong. But anyway, he is amazing. But he decided a few months ago that he needed to start thinking. He and Mark Cole, who is the CEO of his company, started thinking about what's the future. Like, how do you continue a brand even after, say, the personality, right? The persona of the brand. How do you go from a persona brand to a philosophy brand? And so one of the things they chose was they wanted to pick 5 people that they thought, or they wanted to pick a handful of people. I don't know if they had a specific number, whose subjects and conversations and the things they were teaching aligned, universally with John.
Yep.
As John said, I wanted to be 5 people whose messages I would deliver because I so believe in their message, or I would feel comfortable with them delivering mine. Like, and my good fortune is they chose me as one of those 5.
That's
and
awesome.
So they introduced this group recently. They call them the League of Extraordinary Leaders. Like, I want a cape and a Captain America uniform or something. But it's really an incredible opportunity to grow within, move my organization and grow within his, and expand the platform, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited.
But the thing I love about John is in every instance, and I've been with him now for 15 years, off and on. His audio and his video align, right? Everything that he says he believes in, you watch it and complete. And watching him is an exercise in learning, right? You and I were talking about that earlier, about how when he's engaged with you, he is engaged with you.
Yep.
He is not looking past you to the next person. And you and I have been around some people who pretend to be great leadership experts, who are always looking over your shoulder to see who's more important, right? And that is not the case. The other thing is, he always talks about be a river, right, to other people. Don't be a reservoir. Don't. And, when I'm at Maxwell events and he introduces me to people, and I'll have people say, oh, can I get your card? I have a speaking event or something I'd love to talk to you about. When you're at other people's events, it's generally bad form to say, yes, let me give you my card. So one day I asked John, and he goes, no, man, I'm a river, right? I want you to, if I introduce you to somebody, I want you to get a chance to, and I'm thinking that is so different than everybody else we work around.
Yeah.
Who says, wait, what do you mean? You met him at my event, now you're working for him? No, you can't do that. That's, this is a different, his atmosphere it truly is about living out the values that he states. And I've yet to see any disconnect. And unfortunately, in our day and age, disconnects are pretty evident all over the place.
Well, and I think that's why he's been so great for so long, right? It's just
Yes.
you can't be fake and make it for 50 plus years or whatever.
Right.
He's been doing
Yep.
this. The other thing, and I would say this to anyone, our advisors, if you missed him at World Series, go back and watch it because we have it recorded up on iAdvisor. But if for other people that listen to this, try and go see him live sometime, because even as we kind of kicked off about storytelling and presentation, man, he's masterful, but in such subtle ways that you almost have to see. Like, he goes from kind of sitting on a chair by a table, kind of like almost feels like your grandfather imparting wisdom. But then when he wants to make a point, he's up out of the chair. He's on the front of the stage. It's just like a master's class in how to connect with an audience and present. So pretty special.
My name is John, and I'm your friend.
Yep.
I mean, and when he says it, you just like, you can't help but go, wow, like, you're right. It's grandfather. Like, I want to go sit and just let him tell me a story.
We've had, as you know, we've had so many incredible speakers at our events over the years. And just so many people said, like, I've never, like, that was the best that I've ever seen. And so no offense, Don, but So
I know. Look, trust
yeah.
me. No offense taken.
Yeah. Hey, if you come
You've
in
had.
second to John Maxwell, that's not a bad second place, right?
I'm not even sure I'm in second. Looking at the list you've had,
Yeah.
so it's
Okay.
incredible.
So I want to end every one of these asking lightning round questions, and what I say is these are the questions that I try and ask people when I get the chance to spend some time with them or meet them. These are questions I asked John when I was with him. So you good to hit just a few more minutes on these?
Let's
Okay.
do it.
First one. 2020 was an interesting year with COVID and adjustments, especially for someone whose business is speaking, in front of live audiences. But was there a lesson that you learned in 2020 that you'll carry forward with you for the rest of your life?
Absolutely, and it's that he who pivots most easily wins most often. And I most of us we get into a comfort zone, right? I mean, and we're just cruising, and it's good, but it could also be a rut, if we. But if you're capable of taking that moment and not sitting around and saying, how long is it going to last? When's it going to be over? When can I get back to normal? If instead of doing those things, you're just saying, look, what's the pivot need to be? And immediately adjusting yourself. He who pivots most easily wins most often.
That's great. We talk about you writing books, speaking, but you've actually built a big organization around you to help support all that. As you became a business owner, what was the one thing that you feel you've done to graduate from being good to great?
I think first off, it's gratuitous to call me great, but I'll take that. Thank you. I think it was learning to be more intentionally empathetic to my team. Right. It's easy to think of everyone around you in service of you. Right. You're the brand, you're the this, you're the that, and so they're serving you. Well, you know what? What do you know? If I walked in and started asking you questions about your teammates, what could you tell me about them?
Mm-hmm.
And it's sad the number of leaders I talk to who can give you the bare minimum, right? They know nothing about the lives of the people they're asking to give their life to you, right? And that's kind of what you're asking. You're asking people to give you discretionary energy, which they don't have to. And how do you get more of that energy? You give them, you show that you actually care, and it's an easy thing to say, a difficult thing to do because we don't have time. But when you do it, man, changes the dynamic of everything.
Well, and that's just super applicable, I think, to our advisors because so many of them are like you, right? They're the brand.
Right.
The business is built around them. You could see how they feel like, okay, everything's built to serve that brand, maybe not even you specifically. So great advice. What are you doing this year to drive your own personal growth? Is there something you're excited about?
Yeah, this partnership with Maxwell,
Yeah.
that we just referenced. I mean, the truth is that every year, just like I try to go find some place that I can go invest in me. This year, it was trying to invest in this partnership in a way that allows me to learn from the others that Maxwell is bringing in, and Maxwell himself on how I can be better in service of others. If I could be a fraction as good on the stage and other places as he is, I will be better as a result.
Yeah, I'm excited for you, buddy. That's gonna be incredible. So
It's exciting.
It can't be one of your books, but what is the one book that you've recommended most to other entrepreneurs, leaders, business owners?
So, you know what? It's interesting because it is the book that helped me answer your question number two, which John Maxwell wrote a book called The 360-Degree Leader, right? It's the ability to kind of recognize that in 360-degree leadership that everyone in your organization can be a leader. It doesn't matter where they are, if they are willing to lead up, lead down, maybe even lead their peers. And it's our job to empower them to do that, right? And so once you start teaching people leadership skills, even if they're at the reception desk, right, or wherever it might be that some people might think of as the beginning of a career ladder within your company, if you can teach them how to be a 360-degree leader, you will collectively, you're better.
That's great. Okay, final question. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
John Wooden talked to me about constantly evaluating your inner circle, right? Constantly. So some people do on New Year's Eve, they make resolutions. I look at who I give my time to, and I evaluate that every year. I try to be thoughtful. Like, who am I making that inner circle, and are they the right people? Are they headed where I'm headed? Are they maybe taking me in a direction that I? Because you are going to be, you're going to be reflective of that circle, and so define the circle, know who they are, be intentional about who it is you give your time to, and the more you are directed in that space, the better you will be.
Well, as we come towards the end of the year, that's great advice for everybody to evaluate. Who did you spend time around with, and who are you going to spend time around with as we head into the next year? So, Don, my friend,
Absolutely.
it's always fun to spend time together. Like you said, we could probably talk forever about just these characteristics of greatness and how they apply across so many professions. And I appreciate you making the time today.
I am honored,
Hey,
Cody. I would do anything for you.
tell our listeners how can they connect with you online. Where can they pick up copies of your books? Just how can they go find out more about you? And then obviously I mentioned it, but your podcast, The Corporate Competitor, is outstanding. So if you're a podcast listener, go subscribe to that as well. But give them some places they can connect with you.
Easiest place is just the website, donyaeger.com. Everything is there. The last name is Yaeger, but I own both spellings. I own actually multiple spellings of my own name. That's what you have to do if you're building a website. But yes, and as we like to say, you could find the books in all fine booksellers. If they don't have the books, they're not a fine bookseller.
I love it.
Just FYI.
Thank you, Don. Hey, for everyone, if you enjoyed this episode of the Business of Advice podcast, hit subscribe. You can also follow on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, so you know when new episodes come out. And one other favor I would ask is go leave a review. It really does matter. It tells other people that this is a valuable use of your time, of their time. So thank you. And Don, always good to see you, buddy.
Cody, I would do it again in a heartbeat.